Welcome to Off the Wire, the podcast that helps you curb your cybersecurity risk and tackle technology challenges. I'm Tanner and I'm joined by Anthony. We're two IT executives with 35 years of experience. Let's start the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Off the Wire. Today, Tanner and I are going to be discussing microsegmentation. This is something that Tanner and I discussed a couple years back, and we'll see where he's at a couple years later. But before we get into that, I just want to remind everyone that to like and subscribe our podcast. You can find us on video, you can find us on YouTube, and we're going to be soon pushing to Spotify video. And if you want to listen to the audio, just whatever your favorite podcast app. So, Tanner, I remember a couple years ago, it was actually Earl and I, it was at the CTCE meeting. We had heard about microsegmentation, and then somehow we were talking with you and mentioned it, and you're like, oh, yeah, we just started that project. So this was something like I know me and Earl were like a bunch of schoolgirls just asking you questions with it. But can you just kind of tell people what microsegmentation is first?
Yeah, I think for us, at least the way I would define it, is basically a subdivision of networks, even in the intra-network level. Obviously, regular segmentation, dividing networks from themselves. To me, microsegmentation is inside of those networks. I mean, obviously including that, but also inside of those networks, actually segmenting between devices on the same network.
So the first zone that I thought of when you were talking about it, I was like, oh my gosh, if we could microsegment our DMZ, like our DMZ keeps growing and none of those servers really need to be talking to each other. So like you're using that. And I apologize, there might be multiple technologies that do this, but using is it using like Microsoft's firewall or is it using some other tool? Like how is it segmenting?
Yeah, I mean, I think let me start from the tools I think you can use to segment. A lot of people, and unfortunately, a lot of small and medium businesses, focus on getting things on different networks, and that is a good thing. I don't think that's a bad thing to get things on separate networks, but there's a lot of work that has to happen after that. Sometimes people do the basics, but they don't really go into the full depth of what they really need to do when you're segmenting one network from another. Maybe it's an application server to a database server. A lot of small and medium businesses, and even us included, over time, I always tell people, you don't design your entire server environment today. You're kind of putting it into an environment that's been cooking for many, many years, 10 years, 15 years. So a lot of times what you have is maybe too many devices in the same network.
Yeah.
So traditionally, I think intra-network, you would do maybe a couple different ways. You could segment using like ACLs at a switch level. On the switch level, what we found is that it actually works decently well for certain things, but very much not scalable. If you need to put like an ACL on a bunch of different ports or a bunch of different switches or something like that, it gets kind of like overwhelming pretty quickly. You could use traditional firewalls or even next-gen firewalls like Palo Altos or Cisco next-gen firewalls, Fortinet, others, to basically put them in place between these networks, and that works really, really well. In fact, I would say that a hardware firewall between two networks is honestly about as good as you can do. Downside of those, I don't know if anyone's priced Palo or even renewed with Palo or Cisco or Fortinet, but those things are not cheap. And especially when you start going down to like an east-west network traffic level, it kind of gets unmanageable, not from a being overwhelmed state, but from a price state. A lot of small, medium businesses, and you really got to start thinking about your different network segments with these firewalls. And another thing with a hardware firewall is it's a hardware firewall. And you might be thinking, well, what do you mean by that? What I mean is whenever you buy that hardware firewall, you are limited by the bandwidth that it can do. And you can't upgrade it to go from, let's say it's a firewall that with security measures turned on, it can do 3 gigs of throughput. If you upgrade your internal network from 1 gig to 10 gig and you start pushing, let's say you have backups or something that are taking 5 gigs of bandwidth, you cannot inspect that traffic. That firewall is not going to be able to inspect that traffic going from one network to another. So then you got to upgrade your firewalls. Another thing with internal firewalls, especially, and really external as well, any type of important firewall in an important place, it becomes so critical. You start putting all these rules in place. It becomes very, very critical because if you're really passing like all internal traffic, let's say between networks through it, well, what if it goes down? Now you got a single point of failure in your network. So that's where I think traditional firewalls or next gen firewalls work really, really well, but they in some ways don't scale. Then you got like I'd say like host based firewalls, and they work really, really well. You can push out some policies with like GPOs and things like that. Scaling on those, not the best, right? I mean, you can definitely do it, but it's really, really hard to like broadly make changes really, really quickly, and you don't necessarily get that kind of all your network traffic or a picture of your network traffic kind of coming into a single platform. So definitely something you can do. And then there's like microsegmentation platforms, which typically rely on some sort of agent, similar to EDR or something like that. Some of them use the Windows firewall service, or I think I'm trying to think of the acronym for the Windows firewall, but some of them use that service and actually basically put those rules in place. Some of them kind of have their own firewall service. There are varying ways that they do it. But the nice thing about that is you get a lot of the benefits of being able to control your east west traffic. You get a quick deployment, software based. You're not reliant on hardware. So if let's say you have it on a VM and you upgrade that VM from a 1 gig virtual NIC to a 10 gig virtual NIC, all of a sudden you have 10 gig of throughput, right? You have that single pane picture of your east west network traffic and some extra tools that microsegmentation allows you to do, like baselining. You can put things in monitor mode and see what traffic is coming into your systems. We have found that vendors are not the best about documenting exactly all the things that talk in and out of there. So if you go by just what the vendors will say, you put something in enforcement mode, a lot of times you'll break an application. So being able to like kind of see it over time, see what rules are being hit, and then kind of adjust those rules so that you know you're allowing only what is required. I think really kind of having the ability to, if you have one or two or three or four servers on the same network, or in our case, potentially like desktops as well, you can add a lot of rules in place that make them into separate networks, pseudo separate networks, without having to re-architect your environment. Because re-architecting your network infrastructure for some people is just not a possibility with the staff they have.
We're pretty fortunate to have the networking folks we do at our co-op, and I just remember because it wasn't that long ago that they applied ACLs to all of the switches at the substations just to make sure that the substations should be able to talk back to the servers, but the substations don't need to talk to each other. So if they want to make one change to that, open up one thing or close one thing, then they got to go log into. We got 30 substations. Some of them are stacked, so they're gonna have to log into like over 30 switches just to make one change. So like with your tool, they can just do that and apply it across the board.
Yeah, we can. So most of the microsegmentation tools, and I've looked at the top three or four contenders. So I'm going to kind of speak broadly about those. Most of them use a label-based architecture. So instead of thinking about an IP address, like you might think of in a firewall, but they do have object groups in firewalls. They use a label-based architecture. So you would label something, maybe it's a particular database server or database servers. You can have multiple labels. You could say, all my database servers, like SQL servers, let's say you had Microsoft SQL. All my SQL servers have these rules in place, but I have a subset of SQL servers that are, let's say, specific to a singular application. Let's say you have a business intelligence tool and you have a couple of SQL servers that are specific to that. So you have kind of like a general SQL server rule. Then you might have another label, and that label may put on stricter rules for that particular subset. Then you can have more labels. So when an asset comes online, you classify it using the labels that you have, and based on that, it automatically gets like all the rules and it has what it can talk to and what it can't talk to. One thing I really like is all those rules take place whether you're at the office or not. A lot of people think, well, I got a next gen firewall, so I'm good. What about when someone goes home? So you maybe say, yep, I'm denying RDP to all the desktops. No one can RDP their desktop. What happens when they go home, right? And when they go home, that rule's not in place. It's not running through a firewall unless you have maybe an always on VPN that's forcing the traffic into your network. There's no rule in place for that. What if they go to a coffee shop, a hotel, whatever? There's no rule in place. Now, again, you can use the host firewall, but is that really scalable? Nice thing also about the microsegmentation tools is you can put some kind of, I will call it a little, some magic in place where basically they can detect whether you're inside your network and outside your network, and then they can apply a different set of rules for each. If you're inside, it can apply this set of rules. If you're outside, it can apply this set. It can, of course, do ingress, egress restrictions, all of that. But basically, yeah, they work on a label-based system. So let's say you had a desktop in each one of those, behind each one of those, and you want to make a policy change on that. Then if it was labeled with, let's say, desktops and another label that was like field desktops and another label that was like substation desktops, let's say, you could make that change and it would apply to all 34 of them at the same time. And we have found that changes very quick. Usually, when we put a rule in place or we back out a rule if we're troubleshooting something, it's a few seconds and it applies to everybody.
Yeah, that's actually pretty nice. You talked about east to west traffic. I know we talked about this before, so I know which way you'll go, but just for our listeners, you got your workstation. So right now we've got Windows Firewall. As a matter of fact, we didn't have Windows Firewall on until probably about 3 or 4 years ago. But we got it locked down to basically the ports. It allows coming in. But for you guys, since you guys have this tool, like what kind of filtering are you doing in addition to just locking down what ports can talk?
It depends on which tool you use. Certain tools have different capabilities. A lot of the tools now are like one level deeper. So obviously, you talk about ports, right? And what we allow, what we don't allow. One big thing, and I don't think you can do this with Windows Firewall. I haven't seen too many people doing it, but making sure you're doing like that all any block at the end.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that this has helped us with too, is going to that like straight whitelist. We allow 4 or 5 things, we block everything else. And that's all well and good to your point though. That is ports, but a lot of the tools now are actually able to go even like one level deeper. They can actually go down to the process level. So for example, let's say you wanted a particular web browser. Maybe you have a secure web browser. That's kind of becoming a more popular thing. It's kind of have like either a secure version of Chrome, or maybe you only want users using Edge, or maybe you only want them using Chrome or whatever. You can actually say, for example, we'll use Chrome. You can say only Chrome can access 443. So if someone opens Edge on the same
Really?
computer, it won't work.
And
And
the microsegmentation tool can check that?
yeah, it can do it at the process level. So if someone runs a PowerShell script and then you like try to FTP something, or well, let's say you try to connect in PowerShell to like a web server or something, you could actually like say no. PowerShell.exe can't use HTTPS, only Edge or only
Yeah,
Chrome. And if something else, for example, I'll give you a good example. There was a kind of a compromise going around a while back, and this is something that you may or may not know. Definitely our listeners may or may not know, but there is a CLI command tool that Microsoft uses to actually access the web. I don't know if y'all know that, but it's like, I'm sure I'm going to mess up the acronym, but it's either MSHTA or something like that, .exe. So there was a thing going around. I actually saw it on some of the open source intelligence, where basically they were kind of putting up a fake page and they were trying to get users to basically copy and run this script inside on a command line. So they were calling that program and it was accessing the online. So in the example that we have, no, we don't have that rule in place. I think we should put that rule in place. But basically, if we had a rule in place that said only Chrome can access port 80 or port 443, then that exe wouldn't be able to access it.
yeah,
So we would try to get out and it would have been blocked on egress, and that would have been the end of it, because that wasn't, an authorized tool for that particular port. So yeah, you can get it down to the application level, and that goes for ingress or egress. So for example, let's say you had a database server, SQL runs on, oh gosh, 1521, I
that
think.
sounds right.
So 1521, right? Let's just say that is, or we could use RDP. I think it's, what is it, 3359 or something like that. Anyway, whatever it is, it runs on that. Let's just say SQL. So you could say for that port, only SQL Server is allowed to receive a connection on that port. If it's anything else, if it's inbound for like anything, any other processor, anything like that, no, shut it down.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's obviously a little better on egress, I think, than ingress in that regard, but they are working more toward kind of that, let's call it more toward layer 7 abilities with these tools.
yeah, that's something that would be pretty powerful. I mean, you mentioned it earlier, but the whole being able to monitor what traffic is actually happening on the system, because we always have, if it's crossing the firewall, we can see that, but like inside the same VLAN, like we don't know what we got to guess on what the unlock or let open, and especially with like workstations, like we kind of know some key things, and then we just wait to see if someone complains.
Yeah. No, and you brought up workstations. I think that's a really great example, right? Workstations, if you think about it, really don't need to talk to each other at all. There's really no legitimate reason for a laptop to talk to another laptop. There might be a few use cases, but like in our environment, there's no use case for that. You think of all the bad things that could be done there. File shares could be created if you don't have that disabled. Sharing printers, all the other kinds of random little stuff. There's the net bios, broadcast traffic. There's all this other stuff. And really, the desktops don't really need that. They need a few things, and really, desktops in general, especially Ingress, need almost nothing. There's almost nothing that's needed by a desktop. I think people should eliminate RDP, but maybe that's something you would allow people to do if they're working remotely to remote into their desktop. I think there are options now, but there's just really not that many legitimate use cases for an inbound connection on a desktop. Now, outbound, of course, but most clients don't need to hear from each other, and they definitely don't need to be taking inbound connections almost at all.
Yeah, that's something that I would love to have. It's old school, but I'm sure they still exist. Just worms like they're going to try to propagate, and people trying to live off the land. So if they can get into one of your workstations, they're going to try to get into all the other workstations. Making sure that they can't talk to each other would definitely either slow them down or maybe even possibly stop something from happening.
Yeah.
So this sounds like a pretty big project to do. I guess I'm kinda curious, where did you start with this? Like, you've got all these different VLANs. Which one did you guys initiate this project on?
This is a good recommendation. I think it's called Project Zero Trust. I can't remember who wrote it, but it's a great book. I actually got recommended by Eric, a colleague that works in our state and our industry. I read it and it inspired me. Got some of our other guys talking about it and we're inspired by that. Um, Zero Trust is a big undertaking. We still have a ways to go. I think we're farther than I thought we would be. It's a huge undertaking because Zero Trust is not just at the network level. Zero Trust is at the identity level. It's at various other levels as well. Got to reading that book, and that got us talking about this. And then once we were able to get a tool in place based on what that book said with how you should approach Zero Trust, we started with the most important. Well, I take it back. The first initial few networks, we started with ones that were not important at all. That was just to kind of get our feet wet, get our process down, make sure that like we weren't accidentally enforcing something and basically locking down a network. After that, we went for the most critical networks first. In the book, they call those your crown jewels. Those are probably for different organizations. That might be like your top 10, top 15, whatever that ends up being. We'll just call it top 15. So you got those applications. We started there. We started one at a time, one single application at a time, and worked our way through that. Once those were done, we categorized our network into crown jewels, tier two, tier three. So then we just started working on tier two. Once those are done, it'll be down to tier three, and then so on and so forth until we're done. The process, it does take a while. I don't think it's incredibly hard in most cases. There are some cases where it's tougher, but it is long. You're not going to go in there and knock out a ton of stuff in a week
Yeah.
because when you put things in enforcement mode, when you go from like monitoring, where you're only taking a look at all the traffic, to monitoring and enforcement, potentially, if these are your crown jewels, I mean, you could potentially impact your business. So we do them kind of one application at a time, and we have a process where we kind of put stuff in monitoring, we make the rules, then we kind of leave it in monitoring for probably a 2 to 3 week period. And we verify that there's a way you can kind of see where like here are the rules that have been hit, and here's like everything else. And
Yeah.
we verified that like there's nothing in the everything else bucket. And once we've verified that everything would have worked, then we put it in enforcement. And we do that, and then we immediately start on the next one. Sometimes we kind of cycle them. We might have a rolling 3 week process. So application one, and then 2 weeks into that, we start application two, and then a couple weeks after that, it's enforcement on one, and we start application three, and then a couple weeks after that, it's enforcement on two, and start application four. But it is kind of a process that has taken us a while. But again, we started with critical servers first, and I think, if you're going to protect something, we kind of knew it was going to be a longer term process, that we weren't going to do this in like 1 year. It's probably going to be 2 to 3 years, maybe And so we thought, which would you rather protect first if it's going to take you 3 years to do something? And which one you'd rather protect dead last? I would rather put the most protections I can on the most critical things I can as fast as I can, and then work my way toward the least of these.
Yeah, starting off with the crown jewels, and I'm a little disappointed. I've read that book, but I forgot that that was in the Zero Trust book. I thought you came up with the term crown jewels. I'm a little disappointed.
Yeah, no, I unfortunately did not come up with that term. That was the author. Coined zero trust a long time ago. It kind of reminds me a little bit. We talked about AI in our last episode. Some of this stuff gets invented, I would say 20, 30, 40 years before you actually see something come out.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, he coined the crown jewels phrase. As far as I know, at least that's the way it was framed in the book. That was he came up with that. But I've heard a lot of people say like important things are the crown jewels, but that's the way they frame it in the Project Zero Trust book.
Yeah, and that's something we have an idea, but we don't have a formal list, sadly. And I know we're not talking about this, but that's something we're gonna be starting on our business continuity plan. And it'll be nice to get that stuff like identified officially and on paper.
Yeah.
But anyways, I was just thinking if we want to do this at some point, but I know as soon as I do it, we're gonna find out that there's some server that talks like on a quarterly basis.
Yeah.
You can get added.
It's really easy to if you have something go wrong and you quickly need to go back, you can always have an override rule that'll just override all your rules. And a lot of times they behave in like a linear fashion, like you might think a firewall would. It applies like the first restrictions, and the second, and the third, then the fourth, or whatever. So you can work around that pretty quickly. And just like I said, you can apply a setting usually in a couple seconds. So I mean, you can go from enforcement back to monitoring mode in a few seconds.
Are you able to change the enforcement rules at home?
Yeah.
Like, while they're at home?
But yeah, because it's I mean, if yeah, all the ones I know of have a cloud, like, head in, so yeah, very much like an EDR or anything like that. But yeah, you can change the rules, and you can obviously have different rule sets depending on what you want. At home, we actually have even more restrictive rule set than we do at work, and we have a pretty restrictive rule set at work for desktops and laptops.
And that's something we really just started thinking about. We just recently got a DNS tool. We were using our firewalls because they do DNS filtering and stuff like that. Um, and then honestly, it was the insurance provider asking for it. But after we got it, I was like, oh, shoot, well, this is great for when people work from home. We can make
Mhm.
sure that they're not going to these malicious sites that we all block inside our network. So I do think it's important to be putting extra precautions or extra tools for people to help protect them when they're traveling or at home, so I think that's definitely a plus to have that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think back to, gosh, I don't know, the first episode I did, or it was really early on when I joined the podcast. We did an episode about what your users do from home.
Yeah.
We talked about that then, and it's still true. People's home networks are a wild west. Hotels, you have no idea. Some hotels I found to be pretty set up. Some hotels, it's like, who knows what. Obviously, there's the Starbucks of the world and their neighbor's Wi-Fi and who knows what else. In today's world, I think in our space, I'm not sure there's the full remote people quite often, but I definitely think there's a trend toward some remote days
Mhm.
or a hybrid. So you are going to have people actually doing work not inside the office. And so your security plan can't only be focused on the device being inside the office. So just a thought there.
I am gonna put you on the spot a little bit, and maybe you're prepped, maybe you're not, but, for, like, our firewalls, we do an annual review, and, the easy thing is to look at the rules that are not being hit.
Mhm.
So have you thought about or do you have a process on, like, maintaining and keeping this?
Yeah, I mean, we have our policies that require periodic review. I would say priority wise, our priority has been to get through it. And that's obviously the biggest uptick of work that we have getting through all of our applications. And we
Yeah.
have many. Yeah, I think that's probably something that we need to be thinking as we kind of get through the lower tiers is what does it look like to go back? In our industry, I would say applications are a lot more static than in some industries. And one thing that's helping out a lot of things is it's helping and hurting is things becoming web-based, almost every single application. So from an application point of view, usually it's just very few ports. Obviously, from a database point of view, or maybe the database having their own, connectivity, things like that. Um, it makes it a little bit more complicated, but in some ways it makes it easier because man, when there was like desktop loaded up with 30 clients. They were all using random stuff. And there's still some of those. If anyone starts this journey, some applications use dynamic ports. That can be kind of a mess. You have to make some tweaks maybe within the application to make things a little easier or, you know, more secure, I would say. Dynamic ports aren't a bad thing, but if it's going to be all over the place, you sometimes have to open a range where you might not want to. So, like I said, it's definitely not a quick journey. We do need to kind of get that full feedback circle in. We obviously do that with like any changes to the environment, like if some, I don't know, an application has an update or something, we kind of look at things. But having that kind of periodic review is definitely something we'll need to put in place as we kind of wind down on the network side. And as I mentioned, microsegmentation is a zero trust kind of game, and it helps on the network side. It helps a little bit otherwise, but zero trust extends way beyond just network traffic. It extends into authentication. That's the next big project we would like to pick up once we kind of get network where it needs to be. Then it's identity. You know, when do we need to trust somebody? When do we not? How often do we need to ask them to authenticate? When do we need to MFA multiple times in a day if they're on certain networks versus not networks? You've probably seen it a lot on your phone. If you use applications, your LTE to Wi-Fi, sometimes it's like, oh no, you got to MFA again because like you've moved networks. Now I don't trust you any longer. I think zero trust is really, it reminds me of people that are really into getting in shape, eating healthy, and they're always like, it's a lifestyle. And I feel like zero trust is like a lifestyle. When you've bought in, if you really want to, like, I think get the benefit, you got to buy in and take it to all aspects.
Yeah. It's, we were talking about AI previously, and I was worried about job security, and all this talk just makes me feel super secure in our job because our job is never done. One other question, and you ain't got to answer this if it's going too deep into your guys' co-op, but is it your system administrators or your network administrators that primarily handle this, or is it both?
For us, it's our cyber staff that do
Okay.
that. Now, I will say, working extremely closely with those that spin up and manage our systems and those that manage our applications. So
Okay.
I would say it's kind of a group effort. The process might work something like this. They're going to put monitoring in place. They're going to poll the vendor internal systems and applications folks and say, hey, what do we know this thing's communicates with? What are things that we just know? They're going to try to put all that in place in monitor mode. Then they're going to, over the 2 or 3 weeks, they're going to monitor like anything that's not inside that documentation and add that. I will say, like, the monitoring tool, I kinda talked through it really quickly, like, you just kinda move right on, but it's hugely powerful. It actually is one of the most powerful things is you can figure out and baseline what a system's talking on, and that takes a little bit of the kind of the expertise out of it, if that makes sense, you know?
Yeah.
Before, like, if you didn't talk to, like, someone that owned that application and knew it, maybe a vendor, you wouldn't be able to know all the places that talk to. Think of it from a Windows firewall perspective. Like, which firewall rules do you need to make? If it's a SQL server, you're like, "Okay, I know that." I mean, it's 1521 and whatever dynamic ports it uses. But what about if it's just a random vendor server? Think of, like, your ERP or something like that. Just I'm not gonna call out the vendor's name, but we had a vendor give us a list of what their application talked to, the different servers that they had in a PowerPoint. And, so they honestly, they know about 70% of what their applications talk on. Nobody has good enough documentation, and I think that's across the board, and I'm including myself.
Yeah, some of the vendors are Johnny on the spot with what ports need to be open, and some it's like,
Yeah. There's I would say the ones that are Johnny on the spot are maybe like 10% of vendors. And I'm not calling out a single vendor, like, I'm saying internally to us, we still could do better job with documentation, and I don't think that's a lot of these vendors, if they've been a long-term vendor, things have changed over the years, and it's like, did everyone update those things as they happen? You really gotta make an effort, and I think I don't know if we haven't done it, but we talked about doing an episode on documentation. That might be worth talking about at some point.
yeah, that's definitely a weak point for us. I will say Earl just he's, at my co-op, and we were just talking last week, and he's like, "I was just glad to see you guys had something." So,
Documentation is key, and a lot of people, which obviously we're a more of a technology podcast, but I would say I've seen documentation be a company thing. Documentation is really something that like I think a lot of companies could improve in.
Yeah, that's something I actually just brought up in strategic planning. I'd love to see our whole company use one tool. And matter of fact, if you guys know of a tool that would be good for the whole company, please send it my way because I'm hoping to do that in 2026. All right, Tanner. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. That's something we had it in the budget, and we had to cut our budget, so it was one of the things that got removed. And I'm not gonna lie, like it seemed a little overwhelming for us for 2025. We definitely want to do it. We decided to kick the can, but I appreciate you sharing that insight on it. It's definitely a step in the right direction for zero trust, and I just think where it can help protect an organization. And honestly, it could probably help you do your troubleshooting and stuff like that with the visibility you get.
Yeah, we do find that logging capability, but to me, final thoughts for me is you don't have to have a special tool. You can do a lot of things with your host firewalls. You can do a lot of things with ACLs. Even if you can't do it for whatever reason, maybe it's a budget reason. Now, if it's a resource thing, then obviously that might be that's a whole different conversation. But definitely always do something. You always heard that, spend money to make money kind of thing. Sometimes when you use some of these tools that maybe aren't as scalable, it's like, hey, we're getting this for free. We're not having to pay anything extra, and our productivity is going down the tubes. You do got to look at a total ROI. How much time are we spending for what kind of benefit? While you can get it done, maybe it takes 3 times as long. Not always. There's some really good open source tools out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it for me. I mean, I think it's a part. I don't. I think of any type of security patient thing that you do is like a tool in the toolbox. I don't think there's any one thing that just says, hey, we're now that we've done this, we feel like we're good. It's an extra tool for us, an extra way to just try to make it a little bit more difficult if someone does make it inside our environment to move around and hopefully give us as much time as possible to detect that they're there.
All right, that's it for this episode. Just wanted to thank everyone for listening. Please reach out to us at show@offthewirepodcast.com if you have any episode ideas. We would love to hear that. Or if you just got thoughts or feedback on the show, reach out to us at that email address. And you can also reach out to us on our social media channels, LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever platform you want to. And until next time, this is Off the Wire.
Thank you, everyone.